Dick Cheney died. Yes, that Dick Cheney, the former vice president of the United States under George W. Bush, and long-serving bureaucrat, civil servant, politician, whatever you want to call him. He's been an influential figure in American politics since the 1970s. He served as deputy chief of staff under Gerald Ford and then chief of staff under Gerald Ford. He spent 10 years in the House of Representatives, during which he was House Minority Whip at one point, basically second to the Speaker, third to the Speaker. He was Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush and then led his son's Vice Presidential Selection Committee, at which point he decided that, I would be the better choice. He also once shot a guy and then got the guy to apologize to him, which was one of the craziest scandals I remember from being a teenager.
My family and I are deeply sorry for all that Vice President Cheney and his family have had to go through this past week. We send our love and respect to them as they deal with situations that are much more serious than what we've had this week. And we hope that he will continue to come to Texas and seek the relaxation that he deserves.
Because he was a long-serving, you might say, statesman, because he was long-serving, Cheney is likely to get the kind of respectful hearing in the political press that people of his stature typically get. But it's important to remember Cheney not as some great public servant, but as one of the architects of our current political nightmare, both here and abroad. You see, Cheney was critical in the American response to the September 11th terrorist attacks, and his choices turned those attacks from a tragedy for Americans into a disaster for the world. It was Cheney who insisted that in the wake of those attacks, the United States needed to go to the dark side and embrace tools such as torture and rendition against its alleged enemies. It was Cheney who embraced this notion that if there were a 1% chance of anything terrible happening, that the United States ought to treat it as basically guaranteed and take steps based off of that determination, an approach that was a recipe for absolute disaster in American foreign policy.
Let's set the scene. It's 2 months after 9/11. The vice president is being given harrowing intelligence. Pakistani nuclear scientists have been sitting with bin Laden and Zawahiri right before 9/11. Tenet and the CIA brief him. NSC people are there. Cheney says something fascinating. He says, for these low probability, high impact type events, we need to think about them in a different way. Then as the briefing goes on, he stops the proceedings and says, here it is. If there's even a 1% chance that WMDs have been given to terrorists, we need to treat it as a certainty.
It was Cheney who saw September 11th and looked not to Afghanistan or Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden, but to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and was the chief advocate for war in Iraq. It was Cheney and his deputies who insisted that we could fight this war with minimal investment, and that there is no real need for any kind of serious planning for a post-war occupation. It was Cheney who pressured the American intelligence agency into cooking the books to support the war in Iraq. It was Cheney who was supportive and pushed for the nationwide surveillance program under the NSA. When you start to look at all the abuses and all of the worst aspects of the Bush years, you see Cheney's fingerprints all over them. Now, this is not to excuse George W. Bush, who of course picked Cheney technically, and who gave Cheney free rein to do what he liked in the administration. They're both responsible. But it was precisely because that Cheney was a skilled and experienced bureaucratic infighter that he was able to accomplish so much and so destructively in such a relatively short amount of time. And of course, in pushing the United States to the dark side and embracing the worst elements and worst tendencies this country has, Cheney helped set the stage for what is transpiring today. As my friend Spencer Ackerman argues in his book, Reign of Terror, it is hard to understand the current moment in the United States, hard to understand the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of right-wing extremism, without looking back to the war on terror, without looking back to the ways that our choices there have boomeranged and affect us here in the domestic sphere. It's important to say as well that the American presidency as it exists today, the unaccountable imperial presidency that Donald Trump has used to great effect to transform the country, is very much a product of Cheney's work as well. I mentioned that Cheney was chief of staff under Gerald Ford. Cheney is part of the generation of Republicans who came away from Watergate not thinking we shall never let another president act with that much unaccountable authority again, but who said to themselves it was wrong and unjust and unacceptable that our Republican president, Richard Nixon, was forced to bend to the courts and to Congress and to the people and forced to resign in a way that no president had ever done before. And so Cheney was part of this generation of Republicans who have done everything in their power to create an unaccountable executive. John Roberts, who served under Reagan in the Office of Legal Counsel, was one of these Republicans. William Barr, who was Attorney General under Trump, was one of these Republicans. The unaccountable executive, the executive that acts without congressional authorization, that takes upon huge amounts of power, is a bipartisan project. But the acceleration of this during the 2000s, that is a Cheney project. That is a function of Cheney's response to 9/11 and Cheney's view of how to conduct a so-called war on terror. There is some nostalgia here and there for the George W. Bush years, which is driven in part by clips of speeches that have gone around of Bush back in the 2000s. And here I'm going to sort of admit the fact that I am very much a child of the 2000s. I was a teenager during those years. At the time, we thought those clips showed Bush's just basic idiocy and inability to communicate with the public. But looking from the perspective of today, with the current president and even the previous president, two men not known for their ability to communicate in cogent ways, looking from the perspective of today, Bush seems practically articulate and intelligent. And there's this notion that American politics were more normal or more calm during the Bush years, that the Republican Party in particular was more respectable. And I just want to make clear that none of that is the case. None of that is true. This isn't just my Bush derangement syndrome or my Cheney derangement syndrome speaking. To look back at the Bush years is to see a Republican Party whose contempt for governing laid the stage for today's Republican Party and its contempt for governing. A Republican Party whose contempt for the truth, a Bush administration whose contempt for the truth brought the United States into two ruinous wars and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Iraqis and Afghans. A Republican Party and an administration whose willingness to pal around with the extremist elements in their party set the stage for the rise of the extreme right as part of the Republican mainstream. A Republican Party and an administration that took 10 years that the United States had to respond to climate change and pissed it away for the sake of fossil fuel interests. If not for George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and that Republican Party, we would not have the reactionary Supreme Court that is steadily chipping away at the rights of tens of millions of Americans. And the gross levels of income inequality we experience were accelerated under Bush, who cut taxes to the tune of trillions for the wealthiest Americans. The only thing you can say for that period of time, for Bush and for Cheney and for that Republican Party, is they weren't openly opposed to constitutional democracy in the United States, that they paid lip service to the idea that we are self-governing people and the people deserve to choose who their leaders are. And even there, and even then, we cannot forget the circumstances of Bush's election in 2000, nor can we ignore the extent to which his administration brought in tons of voter fraud, obsessives, who would go on after the fact to shape Republican policy towards vote suppression in the 2010s and the 2020s. This was supposed to just be about Cheney, and it's gone on to be about the entire Bush administration, but that should just be a reminder that Cheney represents some of the worst tendencies in American politics, and that Cheney's tenure as vice president, along with Bush's tenure as president, were outright disasters for this country. And to repeat myself for a third time, you cannot understand anything about what we are experiencing now without looking to Dick Cheney and looking to George W. Bush. That's all I have to say about that. Cheney was 84 years old, and I'm sure his family will miss him.